I lived in a town in the north of England and was doing a business studies course at college. I really wanted to study literature, but the careers advisor had said I would never get a proper job if I did that, so business studies it was. Every weekday morning outside of the holidays I left the house around 8:30 and headed to college. It was a dull, frustrating grind. On the day that everything changed, I was still half asleep as I stepped out into the street. It was December and starting to rain. I shivered and pulled the front door closed behind me. The curtains were opening in the house of the people who lived opposite. I could see their TV screen through the window, a patch of blurred brightness in the gray winter light that hung over the rest of the street. Wishing I was inside and warm with nothing to do but watch TV, I buried my hands in my pockets and set off. The college was a mile or so from my house. I had a student pass and could get a discounted ticket on the bus, but the buses were so unreliable it was usually quicker to walk. The rain was getting heavier, and I hesitated, wondering if I should wait at the bus stop for once. I decided it was not worth it, put my head down and plowed on. I was soaked wet through and a couple of minutes away from the college when a bus I could have caught drove past me and pulled up at the stop opposite the college entrance. I growled under my breath. The world hated me. Dripping and scowling, I walked on. The college building was a modern, bland structure that stood on the outskirts of my hometown. Beyond the college, the abandoned steel mill dominated the horizon. Its exterior had grown dark with dirt over the years. The chimneys which had vented the furnaces looked to my eyes like scars in the sky. This building had been the making and the breaking of my hometown. Hundreds of people had worked there once, earning a good living. My father among them. My mother was a nurse at the local hospital, and most of her patients at the time were either workers at the steel mill or their families. These had been the best years. I had still been at school 5 years ago when everything soured. The company that had owned the steel mill had closed it and moved their operations abroad. Everyone who had worked there was made redundant. I remember flurries of defiance from the townsfolk. Signs were made, marches organized, vigils held. One claustrophobically hot summer night, a riot broke out. The sound of sirens and the smell of smoke that reached me in my bedroom seemed incredibly exciting at the time. Despite this, the steel mill stayed closed, and people slowly gave up. A few moved away, most stayed. My mother dealt a lot of the time now with health issues rooted in unemployment and poverty. My father was one of those who had gone away. I could never forgive him for this. I turned away from the steel mill and went into college for another day of learning things I did not want to know. Slumped into my usual seat at the back of the classroom, I yawned. First up this morning was Mr. Taylor with accountancy. I glanced up as he came into the room and started to speak. But I wasn't paying any attention to him. I was staring at the girl sitting at the desk next to me. I had not seen her take her place. I had no idea who she was. And I was captivated. She was beautiful. She had long jet black hair and wore a baggy black pullover. Scuffed black boots emerged from under her long black skirt. And she was giving me a filthy look. Because she'd noticed I was staring at her, I realized with a white-hot flush of embarrassment. I looked away so quickly I might as well have held up a sign saying, "That's right. I was staring at you because I'm a total creep." I spent the rest of the lesson forcing myself to look straight ahead and nowhere else. When class finally ended, chairs clattered, and students chatted as everyone else drifted out. I glanced over to make sure the girl had gone. She was, which meant I could leave without having to walk past her. I sighed and left the room, wishing I was not a loser who worried about everything. Students wandered along the corridor, some in their own little groups and everyone with their eyes fixed on their phones. I had nothing else to do, so I decided to go for a walk in the break. I took out my phone and pretended to be engrossed in messages like everyone else so I wouldn't stand out. I actually only had one message. It was from my mom letting me know she had to go into work early and wouldn't be back until late. The message ended with a pizza emoji and a smiling face, which was her way of telling me there was a pizza in the freezer for my dinner. I replied with a happily drooling face and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, which meant I could find somewhere to sit and read the book I had in my backpack rather than just wandering about aimlessly. I took my book out. It was by my favorite horror author, and I had already read it 3 times. The cover was torn just above the face of the vampire rising from its grave. I was looking forward to losing myself in its pages when I heard someone say, "Vampires are the best." I looked up, and felt my cheeks begin to burn. It was the new girl from my class. She was standing right next to me, close enough to make me feel dizzy. And now she was looking at me, expecting me to say something, I realized with dread. I breathed in, swallowed, and said, A look of what I was sure was pity passed across her face, while all I could do was stand there and wish a hole would open in the ground below my feet and swallow me up. I'd hurtle down into the magma at the center of the earth and melt out of existence then. If only life had been so simple. A group of 4 students had emerged from the college. I knew who they were, and they knew me. Unfortunately, they were the nearest thing the college had to cool kids. They were all designer clothes and sneers, and, as far as they were concerned, I was the human equivalent of dirt you wiped off your shoe. One of them shouted out to me, "Hey, the world's biggest nerd has got himself a girlfriend." Another of them added, "From the bargain basement." Then they all burst into laughter. I died a little more inside but did not react. I never did to their taunts. Next to me, the girl had become very still. She was looking straight at the group and there was a fiery expression on her face. Slowly, deliberately she raised her hand and extended her middle finger at them. She did not say anything. She did not need to. I waited for the group to respond violently. But their shoulders were hunched, their eyes looking away. Because someone had stood up to them and they'd shown their true colors. They were cowards, bullies, now walking away with their tails between their legs. The girl lowered her hand and said, "I hate people like that." "Me too," I replied without thinking about it first. "I'm Jane," she said. "Toby," I mumbled. I was thinking now, convinced the next words out of my mouth would be monumentally stupid. Jane pushed a strand of hair away from her face and I couldn't help but stare at her again. I was shy, scared of my own shadow and uncomfortable in my own skin. I did not like to even see myself in a mirror. When I did, I saw someone who was shapeless and dull. She was everything I was not. "Well, Toby," she said, bringing me out of my daze, "I don't think I can sit through another lesson today without going stark, screaming mad with boredom. Shall we get out of here?" I managed to say, "Yes." She set off walking in the direction of the abandoned steel mill and I followed. The steel mill was surrounded by a wasteland of concrete slabs, broken bricks and long unused roads. Bedraggled weeds curling up from cracks in the ground were the only signs of life. After a few minutes, Jane asked, "Have you lived around here long?" Yes, all my life," I replied. "Nightmare," she responded. "I'm here because my dad has got a job at the hospital. He's a bureaucrat who knows nothing about medicine." At the mention of her dad, thoughts of my own father returned unbidden. I remembered him sitting in the front room at home, a year after the steel mill closed. He'd been drinking again and was slurring his words as he talked about how he was nothing without his job at the steel mill. A few nights later he walked out of the house, and that was him. He was gone. I pushed these unwelcome memories away and tried to focus back on Jane. She was saying, "And as soon as I'm old enough, I'm off. Going to live in London or Paris or New York. Somewhere exciting." She had been staring into the distance as she spoke, as if she was visualizing her future away from here. Now, she turned to look at me and added, "Until then, let's have some fun." We had reached the wire fence which enclosed the steel mill. It had been erected shortly after the closure. Jane rattled the fence with her hand and said, "Let's break in." My heart sank. I knew that the steel mill had been stripped of everything worth stealing by the owners before they abandoned it, but dangers remained. Fragments of rusted metal that could cut and poison you, shadow-masked spaces where you could fall and break bones, dust-clogged air that could choke. I had never been inside the steel mill to experience this for myself, but we'd had graphic talks at school and my mother had repeated these warnings frequently while I was growing up. This had stayed with me and, even to this day, there was no way I wanted to go into the steel mill. But Jane was smiling at me and her eyes smoldered. My temperature soared, my resolve buckled, all sense dissolved. "That sounds great," I said, and started looking for a way to get through the fence. It was filthy and worn but held firm as we tested it with kicks. We skirted one edge and there was still no way through. The search for a flaw went on, until Jane exclaimed, "Yes." She put her fingertips through a break in the fence and opened up a gap. It was narrow and the edges of the metal looked very sharp. "You first," she said. I squeezed through, held it open for Jane, and she followed. Her pullover snagged on the way, and she slipped out of and left it hanging there. She was wearing a faded t-shirt underneath and a slim, sharp-tipped pendant that hung on a chain around her neck. She straightened it, then we started to walk around the steel mill looking for a way in. After 10 minutes or so we saw what could have once been a door. A dark sheet of metal looked to be securely fixed in place over it. The rain was falling again, and the metal barrier was slick. Dirty rivulets ran in trails down its surface. Jane put a forefinger against the wall and traced a line through the covering of rain. Her hand drifted to one edge and she said, "It's loose here, I'm sure of it." She spun round and began searching the rubble-strewn ground. With a cry of satisfaction, she lifted up a section of steel rebar she had found. She forced one end of the rebar into a gap at the side of the metal, then she began to pull back on it, using the rebar as a lever. "Help me," she muttered through gritted teeth. I grabbed the free end of the rebar, and we used our combined strength and weight to try and force the barrier away. A crack filled the air and, at first, I thought the rebar had snapped, then I saw that the plate had moved. Jane did not hesitate. She slipped through the gap that had been created. I followed, once more caught in her wake. The dark enveloped me as I stepped inside. I was aware of my heart beating. I could feel the cold pressing against my skin. A light appeared to my left. It flashed upwards to reveal Jane's smiling face, and I realized it was the torch on her phone. Her voice rippled with excitement as she said, "This is amazing." She turned the beam in an arc. It picked out pitted concrete, brick and steel ravaged by dirt and rust, then a darkness too distant for the torch to pierce. Jane started to move that way. I kept pace. My eyes must have started to adjust, because I could see shapes beginning to appear ahead of us outside of the slim shaft of light. As we progressed further, and my senses continued to adapt, the shapes resolved into the crude outlines of vast machinery. My imagination raced and I could have almost believed I was in an alien spaceship. Jane started to play her torch over the strange landscape, the light picking out dials and levers, and then, lying on the ground, a safety helmet. I walked over to the helmet and picked it up. There was something scrawled on its side in faded lettering. I turned on the torch on my phone and directed it at the lettering. It read, "Tom Johnson, Foreman." And the alien spaceship was gone, replaced by the abandoned former workplace of ordinary people. People like my father. He hadn't said goodbye the night he left. He didn't take anything with him. He became an empty place in my heart. I turned my torch off, then put the helmet back down gently on the ground. I was aware of Jane watching me and did not want her to see that I was upset, so I led the way deeper into the steel mill. Behind me, Jane continued teasing out new details among the ruins with her torch. The mouth of a furnace gaped, the base of a vent rose towards the ceiling. She swung the torch back down and something appeared at the edge of the beam. A small dark form. I saw wings flickering and then it was gone, lost to sight. "A bird," I gasped. I'd thought there was nothing else in here, and the sudden encounter had set my pulse racing. Jane had paused next to me. She wrinkled her nose in thought, then replied, "Not a bird. It was a bat." A smile played across her lips as she spoke. I shivered and walked on. We moved side by side through the steel mill. It was silent, apart from the crunch of debris under our feet, until Jane exhaled sharply. I turned to her. She was pointing her torch at the ground. Bones were exposed in the unnatural light. Pale finger bones lying in the dirt, the lines of ribs, the spine emerging. A skull. Its eye sockets were voids. There was a cavity where the nose would have been, and its teeth were fixed in a rictus grin. I stared at them, ice-cold fear trickling through my veins. Not because of that dreadful smile, but because of the fangs which protruded from the upper jaw. They were elongated, curved, and hideously sharp. In the first rush of shock and confusion when I had set sight on the bones, I thought I was looking at human. Remains. But those fangs were not human. They were an aberration. My guts cramped and I began to shake. What is it? I asked. There was awe in Jane's voice when she replied, a vampire. I wanted to tell her that vampires only existed in fiction. That they were fantasy, an escape from the hurt and boredom of life. And yet the thing on the ground in front of me seemed horribly real. Jane said quietly, as if to herself, "It is so beautiful." My mind reeled anew. It was not beautiful to me. It was terror incarnate. I wanted to flee. "Please, we have to get out of here," I begged. But Jane wasn't listening. She was lost in her reverie, lost to me. I stumbled away. Heartbreak and horror were tearing me apart and I couldn't take any more. But there was to be no escape from the visceral pain of this day. I realized there was someone else there, in the darkness. Close enough for me to make out their features. Everything I had felt up to that moment fell away and a raw wave of emotion struck me. The figure standing before me was my father. He was dressed in rags and sickeningly emaciated. His skin was lined and so pale I thought I could see the dark lines of the veins beneath. His eyes were sunk within the hollows of his face. He had changed so much since that night he had walked out on us, and yet there was no question it was him. A single tear trickled down his ravaged cheek and he whispered, "Toby. Is it really you?" His voice was so hoarse and faint it was as if the words were carried to me on a winter's breeze. I couldn't speak, could only nod in reply. His lips creased in a small smile that sang of sadness and pain. "Toby," he said, "I am so sorry about everything. That night, when I left the house, I felt like such a failure. I walked the streets trying to think of a way out. There were no simple answers, but I decided I should stop drinking and try to stop letting the past drag me down. When I set off back for home, I felt hope for the first time in a long time. I was stunned by this. He did not walk out on us, I realized, as he went on. I was almost home when I was attacked in the street by a monster who appeared human until he bared his grotesque teeth. Then I was brought here. I learned that the steel mill had become his lair. The vampire. The accursed fiend. He kept me prisoner to serve him. But then one day while he slept, I fought back. I drove a stake through his heart and his flesh shriveled away. His bones were all that were left. You were free, I said, fighting to understand. Never free, he replied. He made me like him and I can never walk in the light again. I blinked away a tear and said, You've been alone all this time. No, I was not the only one he took. As he spoke, a bat, like the one I had seen, flew slowly into view and landed at his feet. Two more joined it. Seen close up, they were ragged beings. Their wings were torn, their bodies close to wasted away. These are the others, my father said. They are too weak to change back into human form. We can converse in our own way, though, and share the rats and bugs whose blood we drink to sat the worst of our thirst. That is all we will take. The people of the town are safe now the vampire is destroyed. Destroyed and adored, I thought, and felt sick with dread. I turned and hurried back to Jane. She stood over the vampire's bones. The sharp tip of the pendant on her necklace was stained dark. Her palm where she had cut herself with it dripped blood down onto the monster's remains. Her eyes shone with excitement as she looked at me and said, I had to know. Her blood continued to fall onto the bones, spreading through them. They began to shimmer in the gloom, and I watched in horror as flesh began to regrow. Within moments the bones were lost to view, and I was staring at a glistening form that looked as if the skin had been flayed from it. Then new skin slithered across the body, a pale layer that made the creature once more complete. The vampire was reborn. Its eyelids flickered and opened. Its dark eyes burnt with rage as it surveyed the world around it. Jane looked entranced, and reached out, inviting the vampire into her embrace. Its gaze met hers, and then it snarled and lashed out. Its hand struck Jane. She cried out and reeled away. No, I yelled and, acting on instinct, threw myself at the vampire. It batted me away as if I was an insect. I tumbled into a heap on the ground and lay there gasping as pain pulsed me through. Jane was a few feet away. Her face shone with confusion and fear. Our attacker rose to its feet. It was tall and slim, its cheekbones were high, its dark hair flowed over its shoulders, and its skin was flawless. It had the appearance of beauty, but this was the creature that had stolen my father from me. It was repulsive, and now it was considering me and Jane as we lay helpless before it. Its mouth opened, its tongue flickered, and its fangs were revealed. They were the instruments that would condemn us to the shadows of eternal servitude. The vampire began to move towards us. A flash of movement appeared in the corner of my eye, and then the vampire was thrown off its feet as my father collided with it. He had thrown himself at the vampire, saved me and Jane, but it was immediately clear this would be the most fleeting of victories. The vampire was up, crouching on its haunches, its teeth bared. My father lay sprawled on the ground. He looked dazed and was struggling to breathe. I ran to him and cradled his head in my hands. "Too weak," he murmured. "No more fight left in me." I fought back tears, and then an idea came to me in my desperation. I told him, "Drink my blood. It will give you the strength to defeat this fiend." "No," he gasped. "There is too much risk. You will become one of the undead. You have to leave me. Get away while you still can." With this, he pushed me away, then lay there. He was helpless before the vampire's rage. It leapt on him and began to tear at his flesh with its fangs. I could not bear to watch this final travesty and turned away. To see Jane standing next to me. Her face was flushed and streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I heard everything and it's my fault. The vampire is risen. I have to make it right." She held her arms outstretched and cried, "Drink my blood, take the strength it gives." The bats span down towards her, summoned by her words. They landed on her arms and her neck. Their teeth sank into her flesh. Jane shivered violently as they fed. She must have been in agony, but this was a sacrifice she wanted so badly to make. Sated, the bats rose from her skin, then moved with incredible speed towards the vampire. It was still leaning over my father's unmoving form, but glanced up just before the bats struck. They swarmed around it, diving in one by one to bite. Caught in the eye of their storm, the vampire tried to force them away, but they were too strong and too fast. I could see blood streaming from dozens of wounds in its skin, then it fell to the ground. I knew, in my heart, that the vampire would not rise again, and stumbled over to my father even though I knew it was too late. His time on this earth was over. But now he would be remembered as a good man who was taken from us. I held his hand and wept. After a while, I became aware that I was being watched. I looked round. It was Jane, and she was not alone. A young woman and two young men were by her side. It was the young woman who spoke. "It is over. The vampire is destroyed forever, and we have the strength once more to be in our human form. We will leave this place and find our own way in the world." Jane listened, then held out a hand to me. "I am like them now and will go with my kin. Join us. Let me bite you and become a creature of the night." She had never looked more beautiful to me than she did in that moment, but I knew what my decision must be. I got to my feet and said, "My mother lost her husband. It's not right that she should lose her son as well. I'm going home." Then I walked away from the darkness. My future waited in the light.